A 30 years. 30 years of field reports, analysis documents, cultural assessments, behavioral studies, threat evaluations, diplomatic cables, and 114 formal presentations to the Keth's Institute of Interspecies Understanding. And when Trelvaz's son submitted his final report on humanity, it was one sentence long. The Institute's director read it 3 times. Then she called him. Not a message, a direct call, which the Institute's director had not done to a field researcher in 11 years, because direct calls implied urgency and urgency implied the report had done something unexpected. The report had done something unexpected. The sentence was, "They are the only species in recorded history that became more capable each time we tried to understand their limits." That was it. A 30 years, one sentence. The director said, "You cannot submit this as a final report." Trelvaz's son said, "It is the conclusion of 30 years of research. The supporting documentation is attached. 114 presentations, 47 field reports, 23 cultural assessments, 6 threat evaluations, and a bibliography of 6,218 sources. The sentence is accurate. It is the most accurate thing I have produced in 30 years." The director said, "The Institute requires a minimum of 20 pages for a final report." Trelvaz's son said, "I know, I am asking you to make an exception." The director said, "Why should I make an exception?" Trelvaz's son said, "Because if I write 20 pages, the conclusion will be buried. The conclusion is the point, everything else is the evidence. The evidence is attached. The conclusion needs to stand alone." There was a... The director said, "What does it mean, specifically?" Trelvaz's son said, "It means that in 30 years of studying humanity, every time the Institute produced a framework for understanding human capability, every time we said this is the ceiling, this is the limit, this is the point at which they will stop, humanity exceeded the framework within 3 years of the framework being produced." Another. The director said, "Give me an example." Trelvaz's son said, "In year 4 of my research, the Institute produced a threat assessment that rated human military capability as adequate for border security and insufficient for peer engagement. The assessment was accurate at the time. Within 5 years, humanity had built a fleet of 47 vessels specifically designed for their home system that was invisible to our sensors, and had already been inside a reach containment formation before the formation finished closing." The director said, "The pelagic fleet." Trelvaz's son said, "We did not know it existed. We assessed the limits of human military development based on what we could observe. We missed 11 years of construction because the construction was specifically designed to be missed. Our assessment of their ceiling was based on the floor we could see. The ceiling was somewhere else entirely." The director said, "And you repeated this error." Trelvaz's son said, "The Institute repeated this error 6 times in 30 years. Different categories: military, diplomatic, scientific, commercial, cultural, institutional. Each time we produced a careful assessment of human capability in a category. Each time within 2 to 5 years, humanity demonstrated capability in that category that exceeded our assessment." The director said, "Why did we keep making the same error?" Trelvaz's son said, "Because we assessed what was visible. Humans systematically make their most significant capability invisible until it is needed. The pelagic fleet, the CELA boundary zone analysis, the Velcon communication, the ascending relay chain, the Kelvon proto-language, the trade agreement framework in the outer corridor. In every case, the significant capability had been developing for years or decades before it became visible. Our assessments were always accurate portraits of the floor. We never saw the ceiling." The director said, "Is this deliberate? Do they hide their capabilities deliberately?" Trelvaz's son said, "Sometimes. The pelagic fleet was deliberately concealed. The CELA boundary zone analysis was the result of a diplomat reading a document that was publicly available and that we had not read because we did not expect it to matter. The Velcon communication was not concealed. We simply did not predict that humanity would hold position against an unknown species for 11 hours and produce communication from the encounter. The director said, so it is not all deliberate concealment. Trelva's son said, no, it is something more interesting than deliberate concealment. Deliberate concealment implies a strategy. What I observed over 30 years is not a strategy. It is a reflex. Humans develop capability continuously in many directions simultaneously at different rates, and most of the development is invisible not because it is hidden, but because it is not yet needed. The development becomes visible when the situation requires it. The situation regularly requires more than our assessments predicted. The director said, and this is what you mean by becoming more capable each time we tried to understand their limits. Trelva's son said, every assessment we produced of their limits functioned in practice as a challenge, not because they read our assessments and responded to them, because the process of us studying their limits coincided with them studying their own limits, and humanity's response to understanding its own limits is to address them. The director said, explain that. Trelva's son said, in year 12 of my research, I attended a series of UEDF internal planning sessions as a compact observer. The sessions were not classified. The topic was Human Military Capability Assessment, the UEDF's own internal assessment of where their capabilities were insufficient. It was a detailed, honest, sometimes brutal document. 11 categories of genuine weakness. And then attached to the document, a 12-year development roadmap for addressing each weakness. The director said, they documented their own weaknesses and then built a plan to fix them. Trelva's son said, and then followed the plan. When I reviewed the 12-year roadmap in year 24, 11 of the 11 weaknesses had been addressed. The 12th had been addressed differently than the plan described. They had discovered a more effective approach during implementation and updated the plan. They had not just followed the roadmap. They had improved the roadmap while following it. The director said, and this is the pattern. Trelva's son said, this is the pattern. They assess their limits, document them honestly, build plans to address them, follow the plans, and improve the plans while following them. The improvement during implementation is what we consistently failed to account for in our external assessments. We assessed where they were. We did not adequately account for where they would be after they had been working on their limits for another 3 years. The director said, what is the practical implication of this for the Institute's ongoing research? Trelva's son said, the practical implication is that any assessment of human capability has a useful life of approximately 3 years. After 3 years, the assessment is no longer describing the species that exists. It is describing the species that existed 3 years ago. The director said, that is a very short useful life for an assessment. Trelva's son said, yes, it is the shortest useful life of any species assessment I have produced in 41 years of research. Most species capability profiles change slowly enough that an assessment remains useful for decades. Human capability profiles change quickly enough that an assessment becomes historical record within a few years of production. The director said, is this a threat? Trelva's son said, that is the wrong question. The director said, what is the right question? Trelva's son said, the right question is, what do you do with a species that becomes more capable faster than you can assess the capability? The threat framing assumes that increasing capability is inherently threatening. The more accurate framing is, this species is becoming something. The becoming is fast and continuous. The question is what it is becoming toward. The director said, and 30 years of research gives you an answer. Trelva's son said, 30 years of research gives me a direction. The director said, which is? Trelva's son said, the direction is toward engagement rather than away from it, toward the situations that are difficult rather than the ones that are easy, toward the species that no one else has been able to communicate with. toward the governance frameworks that don't yet exist but need to, toward the space above the galactic plane that nobody was using. In 30 years, every time humanity had a choice between engagement and avoidance, they chose engagement. This is not heroism, it is pattern. It is what they do. The director was quiet for a long moment. Then asked the sentence. Trelva's son said yes. The director said, they are the only species in recorded history that became more capable each time we tried to understand their limits. She said it slowly, not reading it, she had read it, placing it. As you're saying, the studying itself is part of what makes them more capable. Trelva's son said, I am saying that the process of being studied, of having another intelligent species try to map your limits, functions for humanity as external documentation of where to develop. Not because they read our assessments, because they do the same thing themselves and the result is the same result. Documented limits become addressed limits. Addressed. It's become new ceilings. New ceilings become the next floor. The director said, how does it end? Trelva's son said, it doesn't. There is no ceiling they reach and stop at. There is no point at which they assess their limits and conclude that the current state is sufficient. 47 years ago, humanity had 12 colonies and an adequate military and a developing diplomatic presence. Today they have 29 colonies, a relay chain 16 stations long, a military that nobody can fully assess, a diplomatic presence that amended a unanimous resolution in 40 minutes with a deputy ambassador, and an ongoing conversation with a species that has been in the ascending corridor for 30 to 60 million years. The director said, and in another 47 years. Trelva's son said, I cannot tell you, this is the conclusion of my report. My career has been spent trying to predict human capability trajectories. The conclusion of my career is that human capability trajectories are not predictable beyond a 3-year window. What I can tell you is that whatever they are in 47 years, they will be more than they are now. This is the one prediction that has been consistently accurate for 30 years. The director said, and you think this merits a single-sentence final report? Trelva's son said, I think it merits more than that, but I cannot write more than that without making the sentence seem like less than it is. The sentence is 30 years compressed into one true thing. The supporting documentation is everything I used to get there. The sentence is the point. The director read it again, one more times. They are the only species in recorded history that became more capable each time we tried to understand their limits. SI will approve the exception. The report was submitted, the single sentence and 6,218 supporting sources. The Institute circulated it to its 64-member research divisions across the compact and to 3 non-compact species who had observer relationships with the Institute, including the Velcon Collective's new observer program. The response from the 64 divisions was uniformly some version of the same question: what do we do with this? The response from the Velcon Observer Program was different. Their response was a note from Seven Colven that said, we already knew this. We spent 103 years finding out. We are glad someone has said it clearly. The response from the Dreshkin Convergence was a single transmission that arrived 3 days after the report's circulation, and that said, we would like to discuss the implications for the ongoing bilateral commission framework. Please contact our diplomatic division. The response from the Sarathvel representative on the Compact's Ascending Corridor Council was a message to Trelva's son personally that said, my people have a concept for what you described. The word means approximately the kind of thing that grows when you look at it. We use it for certain plants in our canyon ecosystems that respond to observation with increased vigor. We have been wondering for 4 years whether it applied to humans. Your report confirms it does. The response from Ambassador Maro Vazic, who received the report through the diplomatic channel, and was asked by the Compact's diplomatic division for a human perspective on the findings, was characteristically precise. She wrote, "The report is accurate. The mechanism Trelvaz's describes is not a strategy. It is a habit. We document what is not working and we fix what is not working and we document what we learned while fixing it so the next person starts from a better position. We have been doing this since before we had a name for doing it. The fact that it makes our capability profile difficult to assess is not our intention. It is a side effect of the habit." She added one line, "We are glad someone noticed. It is easier to be what you are when someone has described accurately what that is." Trelvaz's received Ambassador Maro Vazic's response and read it twice. Then he wrote a response to the response, which was unusual for a retired field researcher who had submitted his final report, but which felt necessary. He wrote, "In 30 years of studying your species, the most significant single observation I made was not in a formal report. It was in year 6, in a community room on a relay station, watching a human maintenance technician explain to 3 junior colleagues why a specific atmospheric processor had failed. The failure was documented. The explanation took 40 minutes. The documentation of the failure, the explanation of why it happened, and the 3 junior colleagues who left the room knowing how to prevent the same failure in the future. This happened on a relay station in the outer ascending corridor on an ordinary Tuesday in year 6 of my research." He wrote, "It was not a significant event by any standard assessment. It was one maintenance technician explaining one failure to 3 junior colleagues. But I had been watching human communities for 6 years at that point, and I recognized it immediately as the mechanism. The specific, continuous, ordinary process of a species that treats every failure as information and every piece of information as something to be passed forward, not heroically, not dramatically, on ordinary Tuesdays." He wrote, "I have been trying to write about that maintenance technician for 24 years. He is the reason the sentence is true. He is one of the reasons. There are millions of other reasons." He sent the response. Ambassador Maro Vazic read it, and then did something that was unusual for an 81-year-old ambassador who was technically in a reduced advisory role. She added it to her notebook. Not the report, not the sentence. The part about the maintenance technician on the ordinary Tuesday. She wrote beside it in the margin, "This is the one. This is the thing that all the rest is built on." She closed the notebook. She had been keeping notebooks for 50 years. This one was almost full. She had already bought the next ones. It was on her desk when she sat down the following morning to review the Theron-Val mediation framework and the Ascending Corridor Security Working Group agenda and the 7 other things on her schedule that were each significant in their own right and that were each, in some specific way she could trace if she followed the threads, connected to everything else. She picked up her pen. She opened to the first blank page of the new notebook. She wrote the date. Then she began the next day's work. 3 months after the report's submission, the Institute of Interspecies Understanding held its annual convening of member research divisions. The convening was the occasion where research findings of the previous year were formally presented and discussed and entered into the Institute's permanent record. Trelvaz's final report was the last item on the agenda. Not because it was least important, because after it there was nothing else to say. The director read the sentence aloud to the assembled divisions. "They are the only species in recorded history that became more capable each time we tried to understand their limits." The room was quiet for a long time. Then a researcher from one of the smaller member divisions, a being who had been studying human cultural patterns for 11 years and who had the specific quality of someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and had just heard someone else say it, said, "What do we study next?" Trelva's son, who was sitting in the audience rather than at the presentation table because he had retired and this was someone else's convening now, said the same thing. The researcher said, "We just concluded 30 years of study. The conclusion is one sentence." Trelva's son said, "Yes, and in 3 years the sentence will need to be updated because they will have done something else." The researcher said, "And the update will also be one sentence." Trelva's son said, "Probably not. The sentence is the conclusion of 30 years. The update will be the conclusion of whatever period of study we do next. It may be longer, it may be shorter, it will be true." The researcher said, "You studied them for 30 years, and the conclusion is that studying them does not produce a complete understanding." Trelva's son said, "The conclusion is that studying them produces an accurate understanding of what they currently are and no reliable prediction of what they will be. These are different things. The accurate current understanding is valuable. The prediction problem is real, but it is not the point." The researcher said, "What is the point?" Trelva's son said, "The point is in the sentence. The point is that every time we tried to understand their limits, they exceeded the limits we identified. This is not a research failure. This is the finding. We were not wrong about their limits. We were accurate about their limits at the time of assessment. The limits changed. The limits always change." He paused. "In 41 years of research," he said, "studying 16 species across 6 decades, I have never encountered this before. Species have limits. The limits evolve over long periods, centuries, millennia. They do not evolve within the time frame of a single research career in response to the ongoing process of being studied." Another, "Humanity's limits evolve within the time frame of a single research career. Mine lasted 41 years, 30 of them were spent on humanity. In 30 years I watched the limits move, not once, continuously." He looked at the assembled researchers. "If you want to understand what that means, look at where humanity was in the first year of my research and where it is now. In year 1 of my research, they had 14 colonies. Yes, they had a military presence rated as adequate but not peer level. They had a compact diplomatic presence rated as developing. They had no presence in the ascending corridor. Today, 30 years later, they have 29 colonies, a relay chain 16 stations long, a fleet no one can fully assess, a diplomatic presence that has amended more resolutions than any comparable species in the compact's history, a formal communication framework with a species that has been in the ascending corridor for 60 million years, and a monument with a wing dedicated specifically to them that currently has more than 400 entries and is still growing. This is what continuous limit evolution looks like over 30 years. I cannot tell you what it looks like over 60. I cannot tell you what it looks like over 100. I can tell you that the direction has been consistent and the rate has not slowed. Study them, keep studying them, update the assessments every 3 years. Expect to be surprised. Build the surprise into the methodology. And read the monument. Read every entry, not because the entries are history, because the entries are the mechanism made visible. 400 times and counting, a human has done something in a situation where doing it was not required, with resources not rated for the task, and then documented what they learned so the next person starts from a better position. That is the sentence, that is what the sentence means, that is 30 years. Well, he sat down. The room was quiet. Then the researcher who had asked the questions said, "What should the next generation of researchers expect to find?" Trelva's son said, "More." "Oh, just that." The convening continued. The record division entered the report into the permanent archive. The sentence was placed in the Institute's formal statement of current assessments, which was the document that guided the Institute's research priorities and that was reviewed and updated annually. For the next 3 years, the sentence stayed in the document unchanged. Then the Theranval formal agreement was signed. Then the Kelvon proto-language crossed 500 mutually understood signal forms. Then the third ascending colony was established 270 light-years above the galactic plane, which was 20 light-years further than any previous human settlement. Then a human researcher at the BIC submitted a paper demonstrating that the ancient archive's signal architecture bore structural relationship to three other anomalous signal sources in the ascending corridor, suggesting that the civilization that had created it had left more than one message. Then the Institute's review committee met to update the sentence. They debated for 2 days. In the end, they did not change the sentence. They added one word. They are the only species in recorded history that became more capable each time we tried to understand their limits, and this appears to be accelerating. Trelva's son, who was retired and was technically no longer affiliated with the Institute, received the updated sentence as a courtesy notification. He read it. He thought about year 6 and the maintenance technician and the 40-minute explanation, and the 3 junior colleagues who left the room knowing how to prevent the same failure. He thought about ordinary Tuesdays. He thought, yes, that is right, the word is right. He wrote back to the Institute. He wrote, the word is accurate. I would suggest the committee also consider whether the acceleration itself is accelerating. I do not have data to support this suggestion. It is an intuition from 30 years of pattern observation. File it for the next review. The committee filed it. 3 years later, they added 3 more words. The sentence was getting longer. It had started as one sentence. It was still one sentence. It was not finished. Neither were they.